In the last video, we defined what translanguaging is. In this video, we're going to be talking about translanguaging pedagogy. So how do we think about this concept of translanguaging in relation to the teaching and learning happening in our classrooms? So a way of understanding translanguaging pedagogy is that it is the flexible and strategic use of students' linguistic resources in the classroom. So it is a teaching tool that helps linguistically diverse students make sense of content and develop their language and literacy skills. And it's also a way of valuing students' cultures, identities, and bilingualism. It's a way of, rather than having students leave all of those things at the door, right? It's a way to really intentionally bring students' home languages and flexible linguistic resources into the classroom to support their learning and also affirm who they are. And we're going to get into many examples of translanguaging pedagogy across this course, but just to give you a few examples of what that might look like at this point. A translanguaging pedagogy might be a bilingual turn and talk. So it might be having students in an English mainstream classroom strategically paired with somebody who shares their home language and explicitly saying, okay, during this turn and talk, when I want you to discuss X, I want you to feel free to use whatever language you want to share with your partner about what you know about the topic, right? So it's making a space really strategically for students' home language. Or in a bilingual context, it might be bilingual programs often, have English learning time and whatever the partner language is, Spanish learning time or Portuguese learning time. It might be during English learning time saying, all right, we're going to do a turn and talk on this topic. I want you to turn and talk to your partner, and you can use whatever language practices you want to share your ideas, right? So it's making a more flexible space within a program model that typically has kind of focused instructional time in one language or the other. Another example of translanguaging pedagogy would be creating anchor charts that really intentionally bridge the language that students are learning or the content that they're learning across languages. So again, if I'm in an English-only classroom, that would mean thinking about, okay, what languages do my multilingual learners or my bilingual students speak? And how can I include those when I'm creating anchor charts? Or really, as we're learning new vocabulary, can we learn the translation for that word in all of the languages that my students speak so that they can make those connections, but also all of my students can start to see connections across languages, or what's sometimes called critical multilingual awareness or critical language awareness. So how can I cultivate that in my classroom? And here you see an example of a teacher who's doing this in a bilingual context where she is working with bilingual students. And so she's teaching them the math vocabulary and concepts across both languages. Another example of a translanguaging pedagogy would be creating bilingual or multilingual books. I've done some of this work with elementary students, and it's amazing to see what kind of work that students can create and the really interesting and in-depth conversations around language that happen when students are creating something bilingually or multilingually. So this book that you see is an example that a second grade group of students created that were in a dual language program. And so all of the students were learning English and Spanish. Some were Spanish dominant, some were more English dominant, some fell somewhere in the middle of that bilingual learning continuum. But together they wrote a text in Spanish about their experience of being in a bilingual school, and then they translated it into English. And it was a really beautiful way to leverage their whole repertoire. I also worked with kindergarten and first grade teachers whose students created multilingual science books. So as a whole class, they wrote a text in English about a plant of their choosing. So one class focused on sunflowers, one focused on pumpkins, and they created a whole book that showed the life cycle and different facts that they had learned. And then they sent that text home, and parents helped translate it, and they sent it back, and they created a beautiful multilingual book that showcased all of the language resources of the classroom. So all of the languages that students spoke in the classroom were then in this book, and parents came in and would read parts of it, and they could take it home and read it with their families. So again, it's just honoring and affirming students' full linguistic repertoire and supporting their learning in the process. And finally, reading books that are bilingual books, or even better, that showcase translanguaging of different Latinx groups is a wonderful way to bring translanguaging pedagogy into your class. I love the book Octopus Stew by Eric Velasquez. You'll see we'll be using it at different points in this course. But that book really does a nice job showcasing translanguaging and is a great book to analyze why the author translanguages in the way that he does, right? Or why does he include translanguaging in the text, and what is the purpose of those translanguaging moments? So lots of ways. These are just 4 examples, but there are so many ways to bring, to make your classroom a translanguaging classroom and bring more translanguaging pedagogies into your own practice. And as we move forward in this course, we'll be talking about these 10 purposes for pedagogical translanguaging. This is something that my colleague Sarah Hessen and I developed as a way to think about really purposefully planning for translanguaging and the different reasons why we might translanguage or create a space for translanguaging for students. So we'll be getting into these as we move throughout the course, but I just wanted you to see them here. And then in wrapping up then, translanguaging pedagogy is intentional and strategic. So it's really thoughtfully designed spaces for students to bring everything that they know linguistically to the task of learning. It's not a linguistic free-for-all. It doesn't mean that if we're in a bilingual program, that we don't think about still having, focused language spaces for different purposes. If we're in an English mainstream classroom, it doesn't mean that we're saying that we're not building in scaffolds for students to learn academic English, but it means that we are really thoughtfully thinking about how we create spaces for languages other than English, right? We create these dynamic spaces for our students. So it's the creation of a space for students to leverage all they know for deeper learning. It also just isn't concurrent translation. It's not just the teacher or the student, the teacher saying something in English and then repeating the same thing in Spanish, and then saying something else in English and repeating the same thing in Spanish. That doesn't actually support students very well, we've found from research, because students can just tune out the part that they don't understand if they know that the part that they will understand is coming next. So it's not just translation. It goes much, much further beyond that. It really is a radical reframing of how we understand bilingualism and how we understand who bilingual learners are, rather than just kind of a one and done activity or assignment. Like, I did my translanguaging pedagogy for the day, check, and then moving forward. So I hope this gives you a little bit of a sense for what translanguaging pedagogy is. And of course, as we move through this course, we'll be going much more deeply into different facets of translanguaging pedagogy and how to design it in your own context.